I'm proud to present to you all our dear friend, a friend of the club, Barry K3EUI. Good morning, Barry, and the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning all. So let me just quickly show you, and then I'll go to a PowerPoint. I'll show you a NANO VNA capture of my 80-meter antenna that's out in my yard. Here's the program, NANO VNA Saver, and I have an earlier edition. Someone said, Barry, why don't you get the latest edition? I said, because I'm a little afraid I'm going to get the latest edition. It's going to mess up and I can't interpret it, and then I've lost everything. So I'm going to wait until I really need the latest edition. So this is like a year-old edition. Anyway, here's an 80-meter dipole, and I'm going to look at how it's behaving from 3.5 to 4 megahertz. I'm going to ping some information at it and watch it comes back. So I'm going to do this live right now and hope it works. I'm going to sweep, and let's see what happens. All right, it's starting to gather data, and as it gets data, it's going to make these graphs. Well, I did this about an hour ago, so it's kind of redrawing the graph. So anyway, just to say, hey, I just did it live for you, but none of the graphs changed. Here's a Smith chart. A what? A Smith chart. So I want to talk about what this means. If you showed me this graph and only that graph, I know everything about this antenna. Everything. Whoa. So I have to explain that, don't I? The graph below is probably what we feel more comfortable looking at, the SWR, the VSWR, the VISWR, however you want to say it. It's sort of telling me where my antenna is likely to work best based on my coax feed line. And it looks like the SWR of 3 is at the top, 1 is at the bottom, and it starts out at the bottom of the band at 3,500. Can you see where I am here with the cursor? That's about a little less than 2 to 1. It would work fine there. 2 to 1. That's a great SWR. My radio is going to work. I'm going to, I'm not worried about getting 1 to 1 SWR. I'm not obsessive about SWR. But right below 3,600, where all the digital nets are, the SWR drops to about close to 1 to 1. Can't get better than that. So marker 1 is at 3,500 kilohertz. Marker 2 is at 3,600. So a little below marker 2. That's as good as you're going to get. Marker 3, 3,700. That's about 1.4 to 1. That's great. Marker 4, 1.7 to 1. That's great. 3,900, 2 to 1. That'll still work fine. And at the very top of the band, about 2.3 to 1. So this antenna, if I never, fiddled with an antenna tuner, it would work pretty well, I think, over the entire 80-meter band. I wouldn't have to worry too much about SWR. It's a dipole up in the woods, and I'm feeding it with about 150 feet of really good RG213 cable. Hey, fine. If I want to see what's happening with resistance and reactance, I'd have to look at this graph. Let me move this guy over here. So do you see this graph over here in red and blue? See where I'm pointing? Yes, no, Tom?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so the blue is over here, the resistance of the antenna. Now watch out. As I'm measuring it in my shack, is this the resistance of my antenna at the antenna terminals? No, no, no. Now I could do that if I took my NANO VNA up to the top of the tree and hooked it up there. No, I'm in my shack. This is telling me the resistance of the antenna as I measure it here, 150 feet from the actual antenna. It's good enough for me. What's the resistance? Oh, it looks like about 80 ohms, position 1. And then it drops down to about 50 ohms, position 2. Hey, I like 50. Why do I like a magic number 50? Oh, my coax says 50 ohms. Why do I like that? Because my rig says 50 ohms. Okay, so the ideal here is to match from radio to feed line to antenna, because that's, let me say, most likely going to work best. It's not guaranteed, but it's most likely if I don't have any impedance bumps. So this is resistance. Well, wait a minute. What do we mean by resistance? It's measured in ohms. Well, okay, I feel okay about ohms, Ohm's law, ohms. Why does an antenna have any resistance at all? This is a dipole. It's not in free space. It's in my backyard. It's got a lot of other wires hanging around nearby. It's got a house gutter nearby. You know, there's a lot of conductors nearby. So at this frequency, my NANO VNA Saver is telling me in my shack, it's looking like about 50 ohms resistance, right around 3,600 kilohertz. I'm satisfied with that. My coax is 50 ohms. My rig says it wants a 50 ohm output. I don't know why. I didn't make the radio. So it's probably going to work really well down here, the blue trace. Then it climbs, and it's over 100 ohms at the top of the band. Why did the resistance change as I move frequency? Why? Can anyone unmute and just tell me in one English sentence, why did the resistance change? Unmute, call out an idea. Why did the resistance change? Okay, see, so that tells me something about where I want to aim this. So the instrument is telling me the resistance of the antenna, as measured in my shack, is changing. Whether I know why or not, may not, you know, it doesn't change the fact that the resistance is changing. The red, what's the red? The red is something very different. The red is measuring the reactance of the antenna. Wait a minute, reactance, you know, Teacher Barry, what's reactance? Can someone unmute and tell me in an antenna circuit, what is reactance? I see it's measured in ohms, but that doesn't help me. What is reactance?
It measures the inductance and the capacitance in the circuit.
Okay, so that's a good answer. So inductance and capacitance, inductors and capacitors in an AC circuit can also have something we call resistance. We often call it reactance rather than resistance, but it's a kind of AC resistance. Now, it's kind of interesting to ask the question, why would an antenna behave like a capacitor or an inductor? That would be a good question, a nice hour-long discussion. But I'll shorten it just to say, if the antenna is too long, it's not resonant. And if the antenna is too short for the frequency I want to use, the antenna is not resonant. What do I mean by the word resonant? That's the key word in all of this. Resonant or resonance means what? What's the definition of the word resonance with respect to an antenna? Unmute, give a go.
Resistance is it's only resistance and no inductance.
Good answer, Charlie. Thank you for the volunteering. So reactance is a measure of if you have inductive or capacitive reactance. Reactance tells you in ohms how far off you are from the resonant frequency, or to say it a different way, at the resonant frequency or frequencies, plural, the reactance is a magic number. What's the magic number, Charlie? At resonant frequency of the antenna, what is the reactance?
It's
a magic number.
Oh, it's zero.
Zero. Thank you.
No, it's zero.
Charlie gets an A+. So keep this in mind. At one or more frequencies where an antenna is resonant, the reactance is zero. It doesn't behave like a capacitor or an inductor. What if I move off that resonant frequency, higher or lower? Oh, then the reactance is not zero. And that's why we have this red graph. So for the red graph, you have to look over here to the right side of the chart, X. Actually, it's showing minus X. I don't know why. This is measured as what? Let me slide it over here. It shows numbers from plus 26 to negative 26. Oh, well, that's an interesting set of numbers. So zero is right about in here. So it looks like the red graph crosses through zero at the top of the band and again down here at the bottom of the band. So look right here where I'm pointing. The reactance is zero up here. The reactance is zero, just close to 3,600 kilohertz. The reactance is zero. It means reactance is zero. It's not like a capacitor, not like an inductor. Translate. The antenna is just about the right length. That sort of makes sense if you've ever built an antenna and you measure the length. You have to think, how long do I want to make this antenna? You look up some formula, you get a tape, put it up, see if it works. So at reactance is zero, that's the resonant frequency. That also coincides to what? The resistance of around 50 ohms. So just looking at this graph, I would say, I'll bet when whoever built this antenna, and it was me, they made it a length such that it would work at the optimum conditions at around 3,600 kilohertz on 80 meters. I'm not saying it won't work below or above, but it's tuned up for 3,600 kilohertz. Why did I like that frequency? Because I'm a digital operator and I like CW and digital modes. We'll get back to will it work in the phone part of the band. Let's look at the bottom graph. This says Z. That's the symbol for what? Impedance. So at the bottom of the band, the impedance, we often talk about impedance as hams. My ninth graders changed the pronunciation to impedance just to get my goat. So that's a different story. The impedance, about 85 ohms. Well, it's not far from 50. But at the bottom of 3600, the impedance is just about 50 ohms again. So you see where I'm going. If I look at any of these graphs, I can sort of predict, I'll bet whoever built this antenna built it for the lower part of the 80-meter band. That's true. I can tell that from the graphs. I can also tell by the Smith chart everything. So we're going to take a closer look at Smith charts. So before I dive into this, if you have a question right now, press the space bar, unmute, and call it out, because as a ninth grade physics teacher, I don't want to wait till the end of a lecture. You're going to forget your question. If I've gone over these graphs and they don't make sense so far, unmute, say, wait, Teacher Barry, I don't explain what reactance is. I'll pause.
Barry, we got a quick question from Gene, WO2W, in the chat.
Yes.
And he is asking how you got your NANO VNA connected to your computer.
A USB connection, little, here, I can show it to you if I can move it. My fear is I don't want to drop this. So on this side, there's a little USB micro connection. On the other side, there's the USB-A connection. So actually, I'm on a Windows 10 computer. So what I did is just plug it in, and I let Windows search for the right driver, and it found it, and it worked. For some computers, you have to kind of watch what drivers get installed. I think maybe, and this is a Windows 10 kind of conventional, about an 8-year-old desktop. I'm not reading the chat room, because if I do that, I can't concentrate. Did that answer the question? So I just had a USB cable and plugged it in. It told me I was on COM 7. You know, the computer picked the COM number. I didn't have to change baud rate, anything. I just plugged it in, loaded NANO VNA Saver, and it all worked right off the bat. Anything else about these 4 graphs, though? I didn't spell out anything yet on the Smith chart. That's where I want to go with this talk. I'm not going to call it a lecture. I'm sharing what I know with you guys. And I realized you never lecture to ninth graders. When I started to teach ninth grade physics, I asked a very experienced Latin teacher who had been teaching Latin to ninth graders for like 30 years. I said, tell me about the ninth grader. I've never taught ninth graders. He looks at me and says, Teacher Barry, ninth graders, they get about 8 good minutes a day. Be willing to share. I thought, oh, what am I in for? You know, like, what? So I realized, yeah, it was a challenge to teach physics to, you know, a 14-year-old mind. But after a couple of years, I could think like a ninth grader. That was a compliment. So are these graphs okay so far? I'm telling you, hey, this is my 80-meter antenna, and I can sort of see its behavior. Looking at resistance and reactance, I understand that graph. Looking at impedance or impedance, I can see what that graph is telling me. SWR, well, we all use that term. Hey, it's pretty low for the whole band. I'm not going to worry about the SWR here. Smith chart. Ready to go to Smith charts? This is a deep dive, folks. You ready? I apologize for the colors. I was modifying this, and suddenly I clicked on something, and all the colors changed. I thought, yikes, what's going on? And I couldn't undo it in time, so they may have this weird contrast. But I like the cartoon anyway. We might get over our heads, okay? We might. In fact, we probably will, but I think that's okay. I did not understand this the first time I read through Smith charts. I had to really take it at my own level and ask myself, well, what does that mean? What's that mean? So I'm going to try to do this at, let's say, the 9th grade level, or maybe the 11th grade level. This is not a graduate course in electrical engineering on Smith charts. And by the way, they don't even teach that anymore. It's old hat. All right, so Smith charts, you ready? Look at the right. There's the Smith chart. Well, that's pretty damn overwhelming. Look at this. All these weird curves and numbers and like, come on, you know, do I need to know this to build an antenna? No, but it might help you figure out how to improve it or what you could do to modify it or design a new antenna anyway. And someone I saw asked about, can I test balance with a NANO VNA? Of course, you can test any circuit. You can send energy into the circuit and watch what comes back. That's how we do with antennas. Or when you get a little more comfortable with this, you can send energy into a circuit and see what comes out of the circuit, like a filter. All right, so here we go. Ready? Take a deep breath. Take another sip of coffee. Here we go. All right, Smith chart. Polar coordinates. Wait a minute. You know, in ninth grade, we learn about graphs and charting, and that was pretty confusing. I picked up math pretty easily as a kid. I really didn't struggle. I hardly ever studied math, and I always got good grades in math. So here we are with a graph of an X and a Y coordinate. Now, we can graph on one axis something we call reactance, even if we don't know what it means. We can graph that. And on the horizontal axis, we can graph resistance, even if we don't know what that means. We can, and probably, you know, if it's a line or a curve or a parabola or a circle, that wouldn't be too intimidating, I think, even to ninth graders learning about charts. What if we take the y-axis and start wrapping it around, changing its shape, and changing it to this kind of a graph called a polar plane? It's like, wait, Teacher Barry, you lost me already. Go back. All we're doing is taking the y-axis and wrapping it around and making a new shape graph. So far, so good? The X graph I haven't messed with at all. The X is still resistance. So here's a Smith chart. The horizontal axis is still what we measure called resistance. And the far left over here, it's going to be where we put 0. And on the far right, it's where we put a really, really big resistance. Call it infinity. And in the middle, I can design this thing for any number I want, and we're going to pick 50. 50. What's magic about 50? 50 ohms coax, 50 ohm antenna, 50 ohm radio, and I'll show you why. So all we're doing is going to take a common XY graph. I mean, you see these, you know, on news shows all the time. Your interest rate versus time, your mortgage rate, your whatever. We're used to seeing rectangular graphs. Descartes. We're not used to seeing, most of us, polar graphs. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about all the numbers yet. On the far left, on the horizontal axis called the resistance axis, the resistance values. Now this is in ohms. 0 plots on the far left. That's it, 0 ohms. What do we mean? No resistance, 0. On the far right, really, really big number, you know, 10 million if you want. We'll call it infinity. But this is resistance. I'm going to force this thing, for me, and I'll show you how I do that, to the bullseye, the center being the magic number 50. 50 ohms is very common because of a 50 ohm coax, 50 ohm antenna. I could, when I calibrate this, I'll show you what that means in a minute, make it any number I want. So engineers who work on microphone circuits often calibrate the center 600 ohms. Or, you know, some other magic number depending on their feed line, their microphones, whatever. But we're going to pick 50 ohms as hams. Now, 0 to 10 is a pretty big stretch. 10 to 25, 25, 50. What do you notice right away? Oh, wait a minute, Teacher Barry. This is not a linear scale. Correct. That's important. This graph has the values compressed, so it looks more like, if you remember your algebra 2, more looks like an exponential scale, or some call it a logarithmic scale. So 0 to 10, big jump. 10 to 25, 25. Notice these are like octaves, right? 50 to 100, 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 500, 1,000, you know. So this is a non-linear horizontal axis. Ready to go on? Remember, hit the space bar if you have a question. Don't wait till the end. So I can look at these resistance axes as series of circles. So 0 ohms is the far left edge. And if I wrap this around, any point on this circle has 0 ohms resistance. 0 ohms resistance. But if I go up, I'm going into the reactance realm as well. That's the way inductors behave. And if I go down here, it's the way capacitors behave. So the resistance itself is 0 everywhere along this circle. Here's 10 ohms resistance here and all the way around this. So all these red circles represent, I'll say, the locus of points, the series of points that all have a common resistance, but a variable reactance. Where's the reactance? 0, only along the horizontal axis here. So as you get on the far right, the circles are compressing because it's a logarithmic scale. So here's 500 ohms resistance, no reactance. But up here is 500 ohms resistance and maybe 500 ohms reactance. We'll take another look at that. Okay, with resistance curves in red. Unmute if this is fuzzy. Okay, so far? Haven't lost too many of you? Okay, so let's look at reactance. So Charlie mentioned reactance is how coils and capacitors behave. Now, if that doesn't make sense, we'd have to even go back to, how does a coil behave with an AC current? Coils resist current changing. Every time they get a current in a coil of wire, it makes a magnetic field. It's sort of like inertia. I used to teach the 9th graders inertia is like this. Take your finger, hold it up, and wag it as fast as you can. Try that. Wag your finger as fast as you can. That's not too hard. Now, from your wrist, wag your wrist as fast as you can. Now, just your wrist, Tom, not your whole elbow. Keep your elbow fixed, just your wrist. That's a little harder. You got more stuff, right? Now, fix your elbow. Now, do your whole elbow. Oh, that hurts. Why is this more difficult? Well, I got more stuff. That's like inductance. Inductance resists changes in the current in a coil of wire. More inductance might be more coils of wire, maybe a different kind of wire, the spacing of the wire. Anyway, inductance behaves in an AC circuit, sort of like inertia here. And I'd say, all right, now wave your hand from your shoulder. I can't do that anymore. That really hurts. Get the idea. 9th graders were much more agile than I was. But they got the idea. So inertia, the resistance to changing something, is sort of like inductance. So we measure it in a circuit, though, in ohms. And we call it, just to confuse everybody, we call it inductive reactance. Hey, what does that mean? It's the AC resistance of a coil. And I'm just saying a coil, I mean literally a coil of wire. So if my antenna, for some magic reason, starts to behaving more like an inductor, then it's going to land somewhere up here on my Smith chart. So again, 0 reactance, J10, J25. What does this mean? J just means I'm on the y-axis. So if I take this point right here, it's 0 ohms resistance, but 10 ohms of reactance. It's behaving as though it has 0 resistance. I mean, that's like a perfect conductor. No real wire would do that, but it's a point on the graph. If my antenna has a more and more higher inductive reactance, then it starts to plot more and more clockwise here. J25 means 25 ohms of reactance, 50 ohms of reactance, 100 ohms of reactance. That's not good on an antenna, because most antennas you want to feed with 50 ohm coax. 50 ohm coax doesn't want to see any reactance at all in order to work really well. So this is bad stuff happening up here, but it's just a point on the graph. If my antenna is too short or too long, it's going to exhibit either inductive reactance or capacitive reactance. So down here we say negative J10. Negative meaning it's just the other way. So if I start to move, what's this, counterclockwise, negative J25 means it's behaving here, if my antenna were to plot here, as 25 ohms of capacitive behavior. That's not good. 50 ohms of capacitive-like behavior. That's worse. Where do I want my antenna? Well, I want my antenna where it works best with coax. 50 ohms bullseye. I want my antenna to plot right here. Now, again, I'll show you how I figure that out. But I just wanted to show reactance curves are always what? At right angles to the resistance curves, even though it's wrapping around. That's what's hard for most people to see, that the reactance curves are all kind of weird shaped curves. They're pieces of circles, right? So the center is moving, right? But they all end up, back here kind of. If my antenna was back here, it would be like the worst possible situation. Infinite reactance, infinite resistance. I couldn't feed that power with anything. So reactance, that's a little more complicated than resistance, but we okay so far? Reactance is sort of like the antenna's too short or the antenna's too long. I'm thinking of a dipole. We'll keep it simple. Reactance, measured in ohms. So you put these two together. Now, I'm colorblind, but I tried to pick two colors that would stand out. The red curves are resistance. The blue, is this blue or purple, whatever it is. So resistance in red. So if I have a given antenna and measure it at any single frequency, it will be a a dot somewhere on this graph. Somewhere on this graph would describe my antenna at a given frequency. That is an important concept. Every antenna at any given frequency will plot at some point on this graph. It will have some resistance, even zero plots on the graph, and it will have some reactance, even if it's zero. Remember, zero reactance, that's good. That means I'm on the horizontal line here. That's really good. I mean, I wish all my antennas had zero reactance. So that's why this graph can be a little intimidating. It's a two-dimensional graph wrapped around and in weird coordinates and weird names, resistance, reactance, ohms. It's like, I'm lost already.
Barry, your email address, okay, for anyone who has any questions post the session.